Hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I am still your host, Dr. B. Happy to have all of you with us as we explore this concept called measuring a nation's income. And what we mean by that is we are talking about how we look at gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is, in essence, the nation's income. And there's a formula behind it, and so we'll talk at length about how this works. So first, I want to talk about economics in a very general sense. So there are two specific courses that we all take on economics. The first one is macroeconomics. That's Econ 201, and that's the course that you're in right now. And in this course, we look at the entire economy from the perspective of the whole country. Yeah. The way I like to think of this is macroeconomics is the big picture. Okay, it's everything. We look at inflation, unemployment, economic growth. We look at the entire country. That's what macroeconomics is. It's macro. It's big picture. Think of it like looking at the whole puzzle put together. That's macroeconomics. Microeconomics, that's Econ 202, looks at individual households and firms and how they make decisions and they interact with different markets. We look briefly at that kind of thing in this course, a little bit. We primarily focus on macroeconomics. So these are the two types of economics that we would normally look at. And it's the reason why I'm showing you this slide is because as we talk about gross domestic product today, looking at the nation as a whole, we're looking at it from the perspective of macroeconomics. So gross domestic product, what is it? Why do we care about it? Gross domestic product looks at the total income of the nation. Looks at the total income of the nation. So we add up all of the individual households in the United States and all of their income that's earned, reported through the Internal Revenue Service. And that tells us the nation's gross domestic product. We also look at all of the expenditures on goods and services. So the way to look at this is take the revenue, which is the money coming into the households from working, right, your income, minus all of the expenses on goods and services. Minus all your expenses. Revenue minus expenses. Real simple way of thinking about gross domestic product. We do that for the whole nation. We add up everyone's household incomes, and we subtract everyone's household expenses, goods and services, and that gives us gross domestic product. That's the kind of the basic formula. The reason why that's important to know is because it tells us as a whole how well the nation's doing in terms of revenues and expenses. The way I like to think about this is your household checkbook. Okay? Household. Think about your house. Think about the money coming into your house, the money going out of your house, goods and services. Okay? And when you think about that, hopefully your income is greater than all of your expenses. It should be. It's the way it's supposed to work. And whatever's left over is called savings. So that's the basic fundamentals of it. The only difference is we don't look at it as just your house. We look at it as the whole country and together. The income needs to at least equal the expenses. If it doesn't, it's called a loss. Okay. So important. For those of you who have taken accounting with me, Principles of Accounting 1 and 2, you remember the basic accounting formula, which is assets equals liabilities plus equity. You also remember the income statement, which is your revenue and all of your expenses. Your income must be greater than your expenses or equal to your expenses. If the income is greater than or equal to your expenses, you're doing well. You've either earned a profit or savings, or you've covered all of your expenses. Both are good things. But if that's not true, your expenses are greater than your income, we have a problem. It means you're losing money on a regular basis, and we need to fix that. When we fix that, we get your income up, working more, or a different job maybe. So, the best way to understand how gross domestic product works and how economies work is by looking at circular flow diagrams. You remember this from, I think it was a few chapters ago, maybe? We talked about circular flow diagrams. And what it did is it showed us the movement of money from the companies to the households in the form of income, households, right? From the households to the markets and back to the companies. Right? It's a circular flow. And we talked about this at length. It was a few chapters ago, if I'm not mistaken. But that's really the best way to look at, understand gross domestic product. Because we're following the flow of the money from the firms to the households, and the households purchase goods and services, and the money goes back to the firms, and the firms pay the households for working at the firms, right? That's the circular flow. And of course, the companies, they spend money as well, right, on goods and services that flow to and from the households. Understanding that circular flow helps us to better understand gross domestic product because we're able to visually see and understand the flow of goods and services and income. So for the markets, we look at the goods and services. For the households, we look at how the income is spent on goods and services. And for the firms, we look at how the firms pay the households in the form of wages. Firms also pay rents, which are a form of services. And of course, profits flow to the owners of the firms, which are usually shareholders, right? Hopefully this looks familiar to you. It should look familiar to you, and I know that we've talked about this several times before, but this is the circular flow diagram that we're referring to. And again, it kind of shows you the exact flow of goods and services and, of course, how revenue is being spent. So, something important to remember as we talk about gross domestic product. So gross domestic product, as we had mentioned, is a measurement of all of the income from the households, and all of the expenses from the households added together, right? And then that circular flow diagram that we just looked at, you can see the flow of goods and services. It's also important to know of the flow of goods and services, what the market value is. So market value is the value that we place on goods and services in the marketplace, right? It's kind of like what they're worth. That's what market value is. It's what it's worth. So when you go to buy, let's say, some used electronics, or you go to buy a used car, or something of value, or let's say you buy a house. All these things have what we call market value. It's what's worth in the marketplace, on the open market. So that value of those goods and services, all of the goods and services added together, that value is also equivalent to gross domestic product. In looking at gross domestic product, we also look at products and services produced within the country. That's the product part of the equation. What's locally? We look at this throughout about a year. About every 12 months, we measure the gross domestic product, and it tells us how well we did for that year. We say that gross domestic product is what we consider the market value, which reflects the value of goods and services. We also call this market prices. It's the price that you pay for goods and services. We call it the market price. We look at the items produced in the economy and sold within the markets from a legal perspective. We don't look at the black market for obvious reasons because it's difficult to measure. We could, but it's difficult to measure that. But when we look at markets, products that are produced in the economy, it's only ones that are legal. And we typically don't look at products that are produced and consumed at home. For example, if you are into making your own, we'll say, let's say you're into making your own beverage of choice, it's totally fine. You can do that. It's legal. There's nothing wrong with that. If you produce it and consume it at home, it's difficult to measure that. So that's why we don't consider something like that when we're measuring the gross domestic product. Yeah. In measuring the gross domestic product, we look at the value of the intermediate goods that are already included in the prices of the final goods. In other words, when we are manufacturing a product, look at all of the final components of that product, its intermediary parts. So, for example, if we're manufacturing a car, there's a lot of things that go into making a car, right? We got steel, we got aluminum, we got a lot of engine components, some plastic, some rubber, and some other pieces. And so we don't look at all of those parts as being individual. We look at them all together as produce the vehicle. And when the vehicle is done being manufactured, we call it a finished good or final good. We only count goods and services, tangible goods and intangible services. For tangibility, when something is tangible, it means you can physically touch it. Okay, I can physically touch this microphone that I'm holding. I can physically touch this water bottle. Okay, that's tangible. Intangible services, things like legal services. I can't touch a lawyer. I mean, I could, but that would be probably not good if you did. I can touch an accountant, but you shouldn't. That's a service. You can't touch, well, you could, a lawn service. Right? You can't touch your barber. These are services, right? They're not products. So, tangible goods, intangible services. And we also measure the goods and services that are currently produced, not ones in the past. We've already measured what happened in the past. We're only looking at what's happening today. That's how we measure gross domestic product. We also look at goods and services produced within the country. So for gross domestic product, I'm only interested in goods and services produced in the United States, regardless of where the producer's from. And we look at things in a yearly basis, sometimes quarterly basis, like quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four. A lot of economists like to look at gross domestic product to kind of get a gauge of the differences from quarter to quarter. But we usually look at it in a total year time span. So let's break down gross domestic product a little further into its formula. Formula. It's a lot of things like in economics and finance and accounting. We look at a lot of formulas to understand how all these moving parts fit together. Yeah, that's why it's important to understand how formulas operate. So let's take a look at gross domestic product as Y. So it's a variable Y. The formula is gross domestic product equals consumption, which is spending of households, how households are spending on goods and services, consumption being consumed in the household, plus investment into property, plant, and equipment to grow the company, plus government purchases on things like defense, infrastructure, education, etc. Plus net exports, imports minus exports equals net exports. So we'll break down each piece of this equation a little bit deeper. We're going to start with consumption. So consumption is the spending by the households on goods and services. Goods being tangible goods and services being intangible. Goods meaning things like microphones and water bottles and everything physical. Services are things like barbershop, the nail salon, the attorney, the accountant, the lawn service. These are all services. Education, service. The only thing that we don't consider in terms of consumption is the purchase of housing. The reason for that is because we're measuring the individual's income minus their expenditures. Housing is an extraordinary event where the spending is on something like a mortgage or rent. That's why we don't consider housing in the equation. Investment. You heard me mention this, that business invests in themselves to grow the business by investing into property, plant, and equipment. This helps to expand the business. They purchase those fixed assets in order to grow the business, in order to function at a higher rate. Other investments include things like residential capital, where, for example, a landlord purchases an apartment building or a homeowner purchases a house. That's residential capital. So investment is where we would measure the purchase of a house. It's an investment. And investment also includes a business purchasing additional inventory. When you hear the word investment, think about investing in yourself. Well, how do you do that? You go to school, you purchase a house, you purchase equipment, you purchase a car. These are all assets. right, that help you in the long run earn additional income, right? Investing in yourself. The same way that a business would invest in itself by purchasing property, plant, and equipment in order to produce more goods and services, to increase its capacity and eventually increase its own revenue. You know, so that's when you're investing, think about those things. Government spending. Government spend on a lot of different things: defense, education, infrastructure, etc. We consider these items government expenditures. Okay. Gross investment. Government is spending on goods and services. Right? For defense, the goods would include things like helmets and weapons and all of the other things that the military needs. And then, of course, the other goods and services would include things like infrastructure, building new highways, improving existing highways, etc. The services part of that would be things like all of the different administrative departments within the government, like the education department or the Department of the Interior, or the Environmental Protection Agency, or the NSA, or National Security Administration, or you name it, TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, etc. Like all these different departments, their services, they're providing services. And then, of course, the spending occurs not just at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. So when DC government purchases a new building, or they decide to provide additional services to the citizens, that's spending by the state and by the localities. Localities like the different different neighborhoods, like Brentwood neighborhood decided to build a new library, as an example. And that's spending by the local government. This does not include transfer payments. A transfer payment is when the government transfers funds in the form of payment for other goods and services, moving from one budget line to another, for example. So that's government spending. The next part of the gross domestic product formula is net exports. It's imports minus exports. Or you could say exports minus imports, it's fine too. That's net exports, exports minus imports. So exports is, of course, when domestic producers manufacture a lot of products, and then the excess that they've manufactured, they export it out of the country to other countries. Yeah, that's exports. Imports, of course, is when goods and services are brought into the United States from other countries. So net exports is defined by taking exports minus imports. So to sum it all up, and I'm going to go back a few slides to show you, gross domestic product is measured by taking consumption of the households on goods and services, except for new housing, plus investment by the firms and by the households, plus government purchases, also known as government expenditures, plus net exports. Sum it up. That's exports is exports minus imports. If you plug all those things into your formula, you'll be able to find gross domestic product. And I can think of a couple of, I'm going to walk through an example with you, but I just wanted you to remember this formula because you'll probably see it on a quiz or something like that, or maybe even an exam, like the midterm. So let's take a look at this example. We have here 2015 gross domestic product was almost $18 trillion. Well, how did we get 18 trillion? Well, let's think about the formula. So we have consumption, 38,218 per person. If you think about the population in 2015, which I don't have off the top of my head, but multiply that by per person, plus an investment of $9,402 per person, plus government purchases of $9,919 per person per citizen, plus net exports of minus $1,657 per person, we find that the gross domestic product is 18 trillion. If you break that down per person, it's 55,822. Now you might ask me, Dr. B, is this good? Yeah, it's decent. It's not great, but it's not terrible either. Pretty good. Oh, I think it is. So, again, in looking at it from a graphic representation, here we have the 2018 numbers. Gross domestic product was a total of 20,501, and you multiply that in billions of dollars. So that'd be 20.5 trillion is what that equals. Yeah. That equates to $62,609 per person. The country during 2018. Good? Yeah, it's pretty decent. It's a lot better than 2015 numbers, right? So again, it's consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. If you add the 13 plus the 3 and plus the 3 and minus the 626, yeah, and then of course a little extra, you get the 20,000. Just kind of shows you how it breaks down in the equation. So there's two types of gross domestic product that we look at. A gross domestic product, we typically look at it on what we call a real gross domestic product basis. Just when we're looking at the production of goods and services, values of the based off of pricing. We do it each year, and we look at the changes from year to year. That's called real GDP. We also look at this concept called nominal GDP, which is where we're looking at things like the production of goods and services and their values at their current prices. We don't necessarily look at it from a year-to-year type perspective, but the nominal GDP is affected on changes in pricing. So the total spending from one year to another represents the overall economy and the production of larger output of goods and services. So as we see the increase in gross domestic product, what that reflects is an increase in overall economic activity where more goods and services are being produced. That makes sense. GDP goes up, that means there must be an increase in the production of goods and services. Absolutely. It also typically means that household incomes are also going up. Because remember, the income must be equal to or less than, must be equal to or greater than expenses. Income must be equal to or greater than the expenses. So as the economic activity increases, That means there's an increase in the levels of production of additional goods and services, and there's likely an increase in household incomes. So nominal GDP looks at things in terms of the value at current prices, and real GDP looks at value in constant prices. That's the primary difference between the two. So nominal is more like incremental. Real is based off of production of goods and services at its real values. When we look at the difference between the two and when we're calculating them, for the base year, when we're comparing year to year, we look at where the nominal GDP is equal to or equivalent to the real GDP. And we look at tables to help us to understand the changes from year to year. So here we have an example using hot dogs and hamburgers as the example, just to keep things easy, from year to year. So 2019, 2020, 2021. We see the price of hot dogs increasing from $1 to $2 to $3 over those 3 years. We also see an increase in hamburger prices from 2 to 3 to 4 over those same years. And as the prices are increasing, we see the quantity available also increases. Remember, this goes back to the concept we talked about of supply and demand. As the price increases, the quantity also increases. So we can figure out the nominal GDP and the real GDP for both hot dogs and hamburgers. A relatively simple way. We take the price times the quantity for each year. So, for example, year one, 2019 for hot dogs is $100. Year two, it's $300. Year three, it's $600. And we can do the same thing, of course, for hamburgers. Year one would be $100. Year two would be $300, and year four would be a lot. Right? So and of course we add the two together. Year one is $200. Year two is $600. Year three is $1,200. So that's our nominal GDP. So let's look at the real GDP. When we calculate real GDP, we take 2019 as being the base year. And so what that does is it provides us an ability to understand the real changes in GDP from year to year. 2019 being the base year, that's 200. So taking that as the base year, we see that it would keep the same price for each year, yeah? The base year. And we multiply that by the new quantities. That helps to figure out the real GDP for each year. So 2020 would actually be 350, not 600. For 2021, it would be 500, not 1,200. So what that does is, in essence, it helps us to understand the real changes in gross domestic product from year to year. That's why we call it real GDP. You take the base year price and you multiply it by the quantities from each year. Does that make sense? Or are there any questions on this so far? Are we doing okay? Are we good?
We good.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, all right. Just making sure. I know sometimes these parts can be a little confusing and these concepts, but thank you so much. The last part I need to talk to you about when it comes to looking at this is called the gross domestic product deflator. think of a ball or a tire deflating. It's getting flat, like deflating. That's what that means. The same concept applies in economics through what we call a gross domestic product deflator. A deflator shows us how we would, I'm going to say this funny, how we would deflate the nominal GDP. In other words, how do we get the nominal GDP closer to the real GDP? Use a deflator, you see? Because in the nominal GDP, you see that the numbers are higher, right? 200, 600, 1200. How do we get that closer to the real GDP? Use what's called a deflator. So here's the way it works. We take, to find the year over year, we take the comparison of nominal GDP divided by the real GDP. So nominal GDP divided by real GDP, and then we multiply that by 100. Get what's called the deflator. And in that tells us how much we're deflating the real GDP in order to get it close. The nominal GDP in order to get it closer to the real GDP. That's what the deflator does. We take nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100, get the deflator amount. So the GDP deflator, in essence, it's a measure of current level prices relative to the level prices in the base year. In other words, we're deflating the nominal GDP to get it closer to the real GDP. We also use the deflator in order to understand the inflation rate. Yeah. And here in 2023, as you know, over the past 2 years, we've been fighting in high rates of inflation in the United States and around the world. The inflation is caused when there is an increase in prices and an increase in the demand, and which also leads to an increase in prices and an increase in demand. And then we try to fight that by increasing interest rates to make it more expensive for people to keep buying. We do that to slow the economy down, to fight the inflation, you see. So inflation is when prices keep going up, and that's what we experience. Some inflation is normal. The average inflation from year to year to sometimes 3%, that's very normal. Prices are supposed to go up to some degree, right? Your wages are also supposed to go up to some degree, right? It's normal. So inflation is a very normal thing. Inflation, that's not good either. So the inflation measures the overall prices as they increase. The inflation rate is the percent change from year to year in order to understand how much prices are rising from year to year. So we take the deflator into account to understand the inflation rate. So inflation in year 2 is equal to taking the gross domestic product deflator in year 2 minus the gross domestic product deflator from year 1 divided by the deflator from year 1. Real simple terms, this gives us the percent change. And I think I told you this before. The best way to say this is you take the new amount the current year minus the prior year, divide by the prior year. And that gives you the percentage. That gives you the percent change. That gives you the percent change of pretty much anything. Then, of course, multiply that by 100 to get that percentage. So, as I had mentioned, prices typically steadily increase. The average has been about 3%. Also, the gross domestic product has been about 3% year over year since 1965. So, the U.S. has been on a very steady pattern. Steady is okay. It's not bad. Because sometimes, as you know, growth is not a steady thing. It goes up, it goes down. Why would GDP go up and go down? Because of things like recessions. That's when the market takes a downturn for 2 consecutive quarters. We call that a recession. Yeah, they could be very short, they could be very long. And so a recession tells us that the nation is in decline for 2 consecutive quarters or more. That's what the word recession means. That's the definition of it. It's where gross domestic product is declining quarter over quarter. Unlike what you might hear in the news, it's a recession is not a good thing necessarily. What it means is that the expenditures are greater than the income. It also typically means that the levels of production are lower than the prior quarters. Yeah. Both are not good things. So how do you combat recession? By increasing the number of jobs available to increase wages. And we also look at ways to reduce spending. Yeah, that's usually what fixes recessions. So that's where that's where the word comes from. It's 2 consecutive quarters of loss of gross domestic product or more. So yeah, recessions aren't good. Usually a result of lower income, higher expenditures, lower profits, leads to an increase in bankruptcies, defaults, etc. If you were to ask me, Dr. B, are we on the brink of recession? Once in a while I get this question. I said, well, it depends. Depends on what? It depends on the country's ability to continue to make goods and services here and for the consumer, the individuals, to sustain their income. As long as they remain steady, those two things, we will avoid a recession. Do I think we're on the verge of one? Maybe. The reason why I say this is because as of today, student loans are off of a 3-year deferment in the United States. And so that means the students have to start paying back their federal loans. There's $1.6 trillion of outstanding federal student loan debt. That's a lot. There are many, many millions of Americans that are now going to be repaying starting this month. That's money that they weren't used to paying for the past 3 years. So will this cause a recession? Is the question that I'm asking, and the question that I get asked quite frequently. The answer is maybe. It depends in the consumer's ability to control their spending and to maintain their income. As long as the income is greater than or equal to the expenses in the household, we can avoid a recession. We'll see, is the final verdict on that. This graph shows us from 1965 to 2020, obviously excluding the pandemic years, because you would see a very sharp V-shape recovery in 2020. We can see real GDP. So the way to think about it is the economy typically always goes up. Go down for a little bit, but it always goes back up. Okay, what goes up must come down. What goes down must come back up. The way of thinking about it. So gross domestic product, it's a pretty darn good measure of how well the economy and the individuals of the economy, meaning the society, how they're doing. Yeah. As long as GDP is positive, meaning we're making incremental growth quarter over quarter, year over year, 3% increases year over year, we're doing well. We're steady. We're steady. But if it falls below that 3% growth, or we see small recession, it can negatively affect how well individuals are doing. But yeah, overall, it reflects how well the country is doing. Economy's total income, total expenditures. Well, a larger GDP is mostly a good thing. It's good for society and the economy. Better education, better health care, better social services. Yeah, all of those things, because the government's able to spend more. Yeah, absolutely. Measures the ability to maintain a good life. Yeah. What does it not tell us? The GDP does not tell us things about leisure time, how many vacations you're taking. It doesn't include that. It also doesn't include activities outside of the United States, outside the country. It also does not include things like the quality of the natural environment, just things that are measured in gross domestic product. If they were measured, I don't know if the GDP would be as good as it is, right? And of course, the gross domestic product would never indicate anything about how well wealth is being distributed across the society. When it comes to GDP, some people say, oh, GDP is always higher in wealthier countries. In some cases, that's true. Not always. But when there is higher gross domestic product, that usually indicates a healthier society. Better life expectancies, higher literacy rates, higher access to technology. Yeah, that's mostly true. You see this in a lot of developed nations like the European Union, United States, Mexico, Canada. All of those countries are doing pretty well. And then, of course, other developed nations as well, within Northern Africa, South Africa. And of course, we see a couple of developing nations that are doing better. Yeah. So in those countries that are doing well, we see higher GDPs. The ones that are not doing as well, we see things like lower life expectancy rates, lower literacy rates, and lower use of technology. But all that can change. The world as a whole, I think, is getting better, but we're still a ways off. So when you see lower GDPs, you see things like infants with lower birth weights, high interest rates, high infant mortality, malnutrition, unsafe drinking water, less school availability. less people going to school. All of these things are indicative of lower GDPs. Fewer teachers per students, fewer televisions per households, fewer telephones per households, less paved roads, households with little to no electricity. These are all indicative of nations with lower GDPs. And if you look at this last slide, it tells us a range of nations. This is clearly not representative of everywhere. You can get an idea of the spectrum, right? And the GDP typically correlates with things like life expectancy or how many years of schooling an individual gets, and overall satisfaction rates. All of those things are very closely correlated. And that's how GDP works. Are there any questions, comments, concerns about gross domestic product, or in looking at like different nations? Any questions at all about this stuff? Makes good sense, right? Hopefully. You all good? Just making sure.
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure now. I don't want to leave anyone behind or, any lingering thoughts. I just want to quickly, again, show you in the classroom where we are, what's due on Sunday. So this week we only have the one chapter, so that's kind of nice, right? You get to leave today a little early, so that's nice. Just to kind of remind you this week, what's due Sunday. So here's what we have for the Engage and Explore. There's a discussion board. I can already hear some of you. Oh, Dr. B, why do you do this to me? It's like every other week there's a discussion board. Yeah, it's a way to encourage you to be active in the classroom, to learn from each other, to be creative in your responses. So for this discussion, what I'm looking for is I want you to respond to any 4 of these following questions. So pick 4 questions. It could be any 4. There's 8 questions here, so pick 4 of them. Now I want you to respond to those 4 with 1 full paragraph for each question. Okay? So that means you have to write a total of 4 paragraphs. So respond to these 4 questions, 4 out of these 8 questions. Respond to 4 of them with a full paragraph for each question. That means you should have a total of 4 paragraphs in your initial response. And then I want you to respond to 2 of your classmates. Those responses don't have to be terribly long. You could ask them questions. You could ask your classmates questions. And try to engage with them. Okay, that's a really important thing. So that is the discussion board for this week. Any questions on the discussion board? Yes, you could get resources from the outside. Absolutely. Sure. No question on the discussion board? Okay.
Nope.
Okay. All right. I'm just making sure. Try to do your responses on Wednesday. The initial post on Wednesday. Wednesday would be best for your initial post. Why? Because it gives time for you and your classmates to respond to each other. Right? So please try to do that by Wednesday. And then Sunday, chapter 10 quiz. Just like other chapters, it's not too bad. You get 2 opportunities, etc. Any comments, questions, concerns? No? Okay. Next week I will be out of town. What does that mean? Next week I'll be out of town. Next week is a busy week for all of us, I think. Week 8, we got 2 chapters. We have 1 hypothesis and term exam. So here's what I'm going to do. I will record video sessions for next week. I'll post them. I will also record and post a review of the midterm. That way, you'll be in great shape next week. Yeah, I'll try to make your life as easy as possible. I promise you. Especially since I won't be here next week, I want to make sure that you're all taken care of. Because remember, y'all are really important to me. Okay, and your well-being is important to me as well. So I want to make sure that I do right by you by making sure that I do the recordings for next week and a reviewed recording of the midterm exam. That way I'll walk you all through it, right? Virtually, obviously, but I just want to make sure I do the right thing by y'all. Is that okay with everyone? We do that way? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, y'all mean a lot to me, so I want to make sure that we do the right things. All right, cool. In the meanwhile, if you need anything, you can email me, call me, set up office hours. I'm always here for you. Okay? If you are late with any work, please, please get it done. Most of you are really good about doing your stuff on time, and I really appreciate that. I do. Okay? I really appreciate the fact that you're working on time, you're doing the right things, you're doing good work, you're doing well. Most of you are doing very, very well. If you are late with something, maybe you fell a little bit behind, I need you to get caught up, especially by Sunday night, because I cannot let you go into the midterm week if you still owe work from before. Yeah. So I just want to get that out there. And with that, again, if you need anything, you can email me, call me, set up office hours. Promise I'll be here to support you in any way that I can. And thank you all so much for your time today. I really do appreciate all of you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Have a good one.
Professor.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.